The words of Greta Thunberg at the 2019 World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, Switzerland. Our house is on fire. I'm here to say our house is on fire. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we are less than 12 years away from not being able to undo our mistakes. In that time, unprecedented changes in all aspects of society need to have taken place, including a reduction in our CO2 emissions by at least 50%. And please note that these numbers do not include the aspect of equity, which is absolutely necessary to make the Paris Agreement work on a global scale. Nor does it include tipping points or feedback loops that, like the extremely powerful methane gas release from the thawing Arctic permafrost. At places like Davos, people like to tell success stories, but their financial success has come with an unthinkable price tag. And on climate change, we have to acknowledge we have failed. All political movements in their past form have done so, and the media has failed to create broad public awareness. But Homo sapiens have not failed. Yet. Yes, we are failing, but there is still time to turn everything around. We can still fix this. We still have everything in our own hands, but unless we recognize the overall failures of our current systems, we most probably don't have a chance. We are facing a disaster of unspoken sufferings for enormous amounts of people. And now is not the time to speak politely or focusing on what we can or cannot say. Now is the time to speak clearly. Solving the climate crisis is the greatest and most complex challenge that Homo sapiens have ever faced. The main solution, however, is so simple that even a small child can understand it. We have to stop our emissions of greenhouse gases. You say nothing in life is black or white, but that is a lie, a very dangerous lie. Either we prevent 1.5 Celsius of warming or we don't. Either we avoid setting off that irreversible chain reaction beyond human control or we don't. Either we choose to go on as civilization or we don't. This is as black and white as it gets. There are no gray areas when it comes to survival. We all have a choice. We can create transformational action that will safeguard the living conditions for future generations, or we can do business as usual and fail. It is up to you and me. Some say we should not engage in activism. Instead, we should leave everything to our politicians and just vote for a change instead. But what do we do when there is no political will? What do we do when the politics needed is nowhere in sight? Here in Davos, just like everywhere else, everyone's talking about money. It seems money and growth are our only main concerns, and since the climate crisis has never once been treated as a crisis, people are simply not aware of the full consequences on our everyday life. People are not aware that there is such a thing as a carbon budget, or just how incredibly small that remaining carbon budget is. That needs to be changed today. Our other current challenge can match the importance of establishing a wide public awareness and understanding of our rapidly disappearing carbon budget. That should be and must become our new global currency and the very heart for future and present economics. We are at a time in history where everyone with an insight of the climate crisis that threatens our civilization and the entire biosphere must speak out in clear language, no matter how uncomfortable and unprofitable that may be. what we must change almost everything in our current societies. The bigger our carbon footprint, the more our moral duty. The bigger our platform, the bigger our responsibility. Adults keep saying we owe it to young people to give them hope, but I don't want your hope. I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. And I want you to feel the fear I feel every day, and then I want you to act. I want you to act as if you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if our house is on fire. Because it is. Our house is on fire. These words from the then 16-year-old Greta Thunberg in January of 2019 reverberate in this place just like they did at that Davos conference. And yet, the response to her by many in the world was predictable and equally appalling. Camille Nelson, writing for the independent newspaper in the UK, writes, Thunberg obviously scares some men silly. The bullying of the teenager by conservative middle-aged men has taken on grim, almost hysterical edge to it. And some of them are reaching deep into the misogynist's playbook to divert focus from her message. It's not a rhetorical accident, says Nelson, that the critics of Thunberg, nearly 17, almost always call her a child. This infantilization is invariably accompanied by accusations of emotionality and hysteria and mental disturbance and an inability to think for herself. Stereotypically feminine labels which are traditionally used to silence women's public speech and undermine their authority. Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, who we heard about today, heard the same accusations when she started programs for adult women. Why would we do this? It can be of no good. Scared the bejesus out of men. The Herald Sun columnist in Australia, Andrew Bolt, called Thunberg freakishly influential with many mental disorders. Sky News commentator Chris Kenny described her as a hysterical teenager who needs to be cared for. Nelson notes that overseas male commentators have used similar pejorative terms, describing her as mentally ill Swedish child, unstable, and a millenarian weirdo. One claimed Thunberg needed a spanking. Another likened her activism to medieval witchcraft. Why is Thunberg so triggering to men? Nelson contemplates that at a deep level, the language of climate denialism is tied up with a form of masculine identity predicated on modern industrial capitalism. Specifically, the Promethean idea of the conquest of nature by man in a world specifically made for men. That Genesis language about dominion should ring here. The columnist notes, by attacking industrial capitalism and its ethos of politics as usual, Thunberg is not only attacking the core beliefs and worldview of certain sorts of men, but also their sense of masculine self-worth. Male rage is their knee-jerk response. Thunberg did not try to be nice when she confronted world leaders at the United Nations. She did not defer or smile. She did not attempt to make anyone feel comfortable. Oh. Another commentator, Megan Varasian, says Thunberg's speech at the UN Climate Summit last week reverberates across the world. Claims by critics over her mental state are alarming. But politicians and broadcasters appear, she writes, to have confused the disorder with mental illness. Thunberg has described herself as having Asperger's, an autism spectrum disorder, and describes it as her superpower. But we have confused that label with mental illness, a label used throughout history to label the potentially stigmatized, difficult women who are told they need bed rest and medication or incarceration. Even today, doctors are more likely to diagnose women than men with depression, even when they present with identical symptoms. Advocates for people with autism have pointed out the disorder is not linked to mental illness. The Australian Prime Minister wrote of Thunberg, "I have never seen a girl so young with so many mental disorders treated by so many adults as a guru." She seems chronically attracted to apocalyptic visions, to fear, he wrote, describing her as chronically anxious and disturbed. It's interesting, that article goes on to quote Beyond Blue, which is a nonprofit organization, where anxiety is defined as stress or worry which occurs without any particular reason or cause. Therefore, by diagnosing Thunberg with anxiety, men are pathologizing Thunberg's concern about the environment and dismissing her fears as baseless and the result of mental illness. History is littered with examples of this, by the way. Former coalition minister George Brandeis in 2015 famously called Labor frontbencher Penny Wong shrill and hysterical after she interjected during his Senate address, implying her comments were due to a feminine mental instability. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison suggested climate change fears were a type of pathology. Following Thunberg's UN speech, he declared that the climate debate subject children to needless anxiety and suggested they need more context and perspective on the issue. We've got to let kids become kids. But isn't that exactly what Thunberg is striving for? A future where kids can become kids? Isn't that the exact point? And because she was not nice, because she did not smile, because she did not bow to the authority of the adults in the room, because she spoke truth to power, she is cast as mentally ill. We said the same thing, by the way. We said the same thing about the students at Marjorie Stoneham High School. They had been traumatized. This was all because of the trauma they had had. They really didn't understand the complexity of gun violence in the United States. We have to hear them within the particular context of what happened to them and forget the truth that they represent. We are all too good at this. This relationship between capitalism and what's happening in our environment goes back a really long way. I go back here to 1964 to Lynn White in the paper that he wrote, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, to find at least one explanation of just how far back it goes, and it is striking. So, look at it this way. Until recently, and Lynn is describing this here, or Lynn White is describing this here, advanced societies, he says, until recently, agriculture has been the chief occupation even in advanced societies. Hence, any change in the method of tillage has much importance. Early plows, drawn by 2 oxen, did not normally turn the sod to turn it over. They just scratched the surface. And then cross-cutting was needed for the fields to be tended, and they were always square. In very light soils and semi-arid climates like the Near East and the Mediterranean, this kind of farm work worked very well. But such a plow was inappropriate in the wet climate and often sticky soils of northern Europe. And by the latter part of the 7th century, following obscure beginnings, certain northern peasants started using an entirely new kind of plow, equipped with a vertical knife that cut the line in the furrow and a horizontal share to slice under the sod and a millboard to then turn it over. And the friction of this plow with the soil was so great that it normally required not 2 oxen, but 8. It attacked the land with such violence that cross-plowing wasn't needed. The fields tended to be shaped not in small squares, but in very long rows. In the days of the scratch plow, fields were distributed generally in units capable of supporting a single family. Subsistence farming was the presupposition, but no peasant owned 8 oxen. So to use the new and more efficient plow, peasants pulled their oxen to form large plow teams, originally receiving, it would appear, plow strips in proportion to their contribution, and thus the distribution of land was based no longer on the needs of the family, but rather on the capacity of a power machine to till the earth. Humankind's relationship to the soil was profoundly changed in that moment. Formerly, men had been part of nature, humankind had been part of nature. But now they were the exploiter of nature. Nowhere else in the world did farmers develop an analogous agricultural implement. Is it a coincidence that modern technology, with its ruthlessness toward nature, has so largely been produced by descendants of these peasants of northern Europe? And here we are with our large agri-farming industry. I remember as a child in central New York where my uncles and aunts had small family farms, and I learned how to milk cows by hand, and I learned how to help deliver calves. But I also learned a relationship to the land. My family grew what they grew in order to feed their cattle, but more importantly, to feed themselves throughout the winter. They're also hunters, by the way. There isn't a winter when I don't go back to central New York State and come back with a huge amount of venison stew meat. But they never hunted because it was fun. They hunted because it was necessary for them to be able to survive a cold winter. If you want to know how cold it is up there, just ask the folks from New York City that went up into this part of New York State in the summertime and found it very, very pleasant. They thought this was just the greatest place to come for a summer vacation, and they went to the highest hilltops in Cortland and Shenango County and built McMansions, and then experienced their first winter. They cannot sell those homes, and they couldn't do it fast enough, and they still can't do it well enough. People learned how to adapt in those environments in ways that made sense for the survival of their families, and we must regain some of that consciousness of our relationship to the soil. If you don't think so, go change places with the people that are being told that there is a mandatory evacuation of counties outside of Sonoma because they cannot control the wildfires there. Or the hundreds of thousands of people who do not have electricity and will probably not have it for another 2 weeks because the system is so antiquated there, one spark from one wire could ravage an entire wilderness. Jonathan Safran Foer's new book, We Are the Weather, goes into this a little bit too when we think about our relationship to the land. Just some small statistics. Humans use 59% of all land capable of growing crops to grow food for livestock. 60% of all mammals on the earth are animals raised for food. There are approximately 30 farm animals for every human being on the planet. In 2018, more than 99% of the animals eaten in America were raised on factory farms. Animal agriculture is responsible for 91% of Amazon deforestation. If cows were a country, they would rank third in greenhouse gas emissions after China and the United States. One reviewer from The Guardian notes of this, these facts, though, are part of the problem rather than the solution. The point is, we know this stuff, we just don't believe it. Remember those children playing in the house and the Buddha, trying to get them to pay attention? And so the rest of the book of Jonathan Lohr's book is dedicated to persuading us that it's our duty to act. It's our duty, writes Fourier, as it was the duty of Jewish leaders in the U.S. to act when Jan Karski, member of the Polish underground, came to them in the June of 1943 of the news of the murder and persecution of Jews in Europe, and the Jewish leaders, and particularly the Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, didn't act. I am unable, said Frankfurter, to believe what you have told me. Lohr's response, by the way, is not all that radical. He is not saying we all need to become vegan. What he is saying is we probably ought not eat animal protein until dinner. By doing this, we radically cut back on the amount of resources it takes to feed us and the demonstrative kind of effect that those farming animals have on our environment. In many ways, we are a legacy both of this vision of dominion out of Genesis and also this vision of liberation that we find in the Lotus Sutra. We are children of both. Ours is to decide how we will enact those legacies. Was the Buddha lying, by the way? Was the Buddha lying? Why not? Buddha said, there are goat carts and there are deer carts and there are other carts here, and you can come out and play with all of them. Then they got out there and said, show us the carts. It's kind of like, Walmart just before Christmas. We have the PlayStation 5. Y'all have to come out and get it. And then you get there and they go, but we just came out with PlayStation 6. Right? The Buddha is actually talking about the Mahayana Buddhism, the big wheel Buddhism, as being one of the supreme ways to understand the Buddhist vision of liberation without demonstrating any kind of frustration or demonstrating any kind of judgment on other Buddhist examples, the other carts, right? And it is a story which is about skillful means, right? It isn't falsehood because ultimately what was at play here was saving the lives of the children in that story, and it's about our ability to use what we have in order to do that, which is exactly what we ought to be about as Unitarian Universalist congregations. Using who we are and what we have in order to be able to represent that truth. And for this, and I will close with this, I go back to my friend Don Robinson in his 2013 Ware lecture, Berry Street lecture at General Assembly. He says, when we leave our worship services and come in contact with those who require our support outside the doors of our edifices, When we go out into the communities and volunteer in a school, at recreation center, or where there are great challenges, we need to do something about these challenges, not just talk about them. You know that wonderful old cartoon about Unitarian Universalists, right? They're all standing in line at heaven, and the sign says, heaven or a conversation about heaven, and they're all turned to the conversation about heaven, right? We suffer as a movement with the pathology of thinking that when we've talked about something, we've actually done something. Think about that. We need to go out where the great challenges, and we need to do something about those challenges, and that's when our ministry begins. He says, now I have seen how much you do for those who seek assistance, face major issues, fall into the cracks of society, and are victims of oppressive tactics. We have prison ministries. We work with homeless shelters and soup kitchens. We form communities to tackle social justice issues. We form legislative ministries, global justice initiatives, mentoring environmental projects. We partner with other organizations with similar objectives. We educate ourselves about the problems we face. We provide meeting space for unpopular causes,